And everyone who registered will get a link to it once I've put it up. If you could hold your questions till the end, if you want to put them in the chat or put them in the question and answer section, we will take those and answer them at the end. And with that said, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Joe Nemmers Jr. was born and raised in Libertyville and is a third-generation Libertyville resident. His dad, Joe Nemmers Sr., was a 1947 LHS graduate. Joe and his late wife raised their 4 sons in Libertyville, and 3 of them and all 5 of his grandkids live here today. Joe is a retired executive with Abbott Laboratories and a former U.S. Army officer and tank commander. In retirement, he has written 10 books, and the very best we had is his latest. He lives with his wife, Kathy, in Arizona, although he's joining us today from Hawaii, lucky dog, and he returns to Libertyville frequently. So thank you, Joe, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks for the introduction. I was glad to see those prints from Ross Schellenberger. He was my art teacher at Highland School and summer school a long time ago. So good to see. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. As Jenny said, Kathy and I are in the big island of Hawaii. When this is over, we're going to get on a plane and fly back to Phoenix. So I'm glad this could work out for us here this evening. Jenny, if you can go to the next slide. So the book is 308 pages. It's got a lot of detail in it. For us to talk about that tonight would take all night long, which you probably wouldn't be interested in. So we're going to do this in a PowerPoint format and take you through it from beginning to end. I'm going to take the first 5 chapters of the book and put them right here on this one single slide. So you're going to have to work with me. We're going to do some theater of the mind. What this slide shows is where our 4 Marines ended up in April of 1945. The book is about the Battle of Okinawa, which is the last major battle of World War II, the last one in the Pacific Campaign, and really the most horrific in what had been a series of horrific battles in the island hopping campaign that had taken place in the previous couple of years. We'll go to our Marines here in a minute, but I'm going to start with this piece of it here. The red line that you see was sort of the high watermark of the Japanese Empire. This is about June of 1942, so about 6 months after Pearl Harbor. It was right before the Battle of Midway, which is where the U.S. began to take the offensive back from the Japanese. So anything inside that red circle 6 months after Pearl Harbor and before the Americans really began to push back was owned by the Japanese. And it starts up in Manchuria, where the Japanese had invaded in 1933 and still had a large army. In China, where they had a 500,000-man army called the Kwantung Army. They fought the Chinese communists and the nationalists, who didn't like each other, but for the purpose of fighting the Japanese, they fought together. Went down through Thailand, French Indochina is Vietnam, down through the East Indies, into New Guinea, about half of New Guinea, and all of the South and Central Pacific that you see listed right there. This theater was so big, way bigger than the theater in Europe, that it required 2 commands. And what you see on the blue line on there are the 2 commands. The bottom line, which starts where it says Allied, was General Douglas MacArthur. And he moved from there up through New Guinea, eventually into the liberation of the Philippines, which is what he was most famous for. The other campaign, the blue one, the Central Pacific campaign, was led by Admiral Nimitz, and that's the one we're going to focus on. And that's the one where our 4 Marines sailed into that and eventually ended up on Okinawa. Where you see green on there are just different places where our 4 Marines were at some point in their time from leaving the United States until they got to that particular part of the theater. What's important about this map, the way the book is written, is the first 5 chapters take the reader through the origins of World War II. We talk about Europe for a brief amount of time, then go away from that. We go to the Pacific and Asian theater, which is what you see here. And then we take it all the way down to Admiral Nimitz's campaign, which is that top blue line. So it's almost like a big funnel. We start out with this great big conflict and narrow it down to one last battle on an island about 400 miles from the coast of mainland Japan, or the main island of Japan. So think of it like this big funnel, and by the time we get done, we're at the very end of the war with some interesting decisions to be made. Okinawa was very important. If you see it at the very top of that top blue arrow, it's only 400 miles from Kyushu, which is the southernmost of the Japanese islands. 400 miles sounds like a long ways, but if you understand, if you read the book, you'll see our 3 ground Marines traveled thousands of miles, sometimes by ship, to do amphibious landings at different battles. So 400 miles was a piece of cake by this time in 1945. Okinawa was important because it was big enough. It was the biggest of the Ryukyu Islands, but it was big enough to accommodate a staging area for an eventual American invasion of Japan. It had the port of Naha as a deep water port, had several deep water ports, multiple airfields, and it could accommodate quite a few soldiers and Marines in getting ready for the invasion. So it was the last piece of a very long 2.5, almost 3-year island hopping campaign that began in Guadalcanal, which you see at the bottom of the screen, in the fall of 1942 and worked its way up. What's important to note is on this red line, I said it was June of 42. That's when the Battle of Midway happened. Right after that, Americans destroyed much of the Japanese carrier fleet and began to shift in momentum towards the Americans. Several months later was the Battle of Guadalcanal, the first successful amphibious landing, taking a very key position from the Japanese. From that point forward, from those last few months of 1942, the Americans were never on the defensive again. The Japanese were, and Americans were on the offensive. Now, one of the things that happened around maybe 1943, the Japanese figured out that they weren't going to win this war. They went into this without a great plan. The tactical victories at Pearl Harbor and the Philippines in 8 December 1941 were brilliant tactical moves, but they were a strategic debacle because the Japanese had no plans for what to deal with the Americans beyond the next several months. Their original plan was to take all of these islands, I'll tell you why they took them in a minute, hold on to them, cripple the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, and buy time for negotiated settlement. So the Americans who were not interested in war at this time would simply let them keep what they had. Well, that strategy didn't work out very well whatsoever. The reason that you see this big red circle was the Japanese had been taken over by, Japan had been taken over by the militarists, the Army and the Navy, in the 1930s. They started the war in China in 1937 on their own. And their intent was to seize the oil fields, the bauxite, the aluminum, the tin, all they needed for war production to be able to seize all of these possessions. What was also going on at this time was the British, who had colonial possessions, and the Dutch were involved with the Germans in Europe. America was isolationist, didn't want to go to war. So the Japanese wanted to become the premier power in Asia and in effect start their own colonial empire. So in addition to invading all these different places to take the raw materials, they would seize them as part of their strategic plan to run all of Asia. And so that's what they did. And that's why you see everything that's here today. So we're going to focus as we go forward with each of our 4 Marines on that top blue line and take you through a little bit about what they did along the way. So Jenny, we'll go to the next slide. So here's our 4 Marines all on one page. I gave this presentation last week at Libertyville High School, and I wanted to impress upon the students, as I do upon you. These 4 guys were not just names on a monument. 3 of their names appear on the Veterans Memorial at Lakeside Cemetery at Butler Park in Libertyville. But they're more than names on a wall. These are real people. As I told the students, they weren't much older than the students we have today. Jack Brown was 19 years old. Lloyd Iverson had just turned 21, and Jack Trinovich, Ole Ekstrom died just short of their 22nd birthday. So these were all very young men. All 5 of these guys were sons of immigrants. I'll tell you about that in just a second. Ole Ekstrom himself was an immigrant. He and his parents were born in Sweden and came to the U.S. in the mid-1920s. All 4 of these guys enlisted. They weren't drafted. They didn't wait to be drafted. They enlisted in the Marine Corps, which then, as now, was the smallest but also considered the toughest of the U.S. military branches. Not really clear why all 4 of them joined the Marines, but they were all athletes, as I'll tell you in a second. I think the Corps appealed to them for that reason. They knew darn well what they were doing at this time. So Jack Trinovich, Ole Ekstrom, the 2 you see in the middle, graduated from high school in 41. They were out working a year. 6 months later, Pearl Harbor happened. And then about a year after they were out, they enlisted. Lloyd Iverson at the same time, Jack Brown a year later. At the time all of them enlisted, they knew exactly that all Marines were being sent to the Pacific. Very few ever went to Europe. They were all going to the Pacific. They knew that the Japanese were a formidable foe and the fighting was ferocious. And they knew they were sailing into hell, which is essentially what happened to them. And they went anyway. And as I told the students last week, that's really the very definition of a hero. So one of the things that's important to know about these guys was they were all very well known. I had a chance last October to come to Libertyville High School and talk to the leadership team. And I told the teachers, these are the kind of guys you'd like to have in class. They were very popular with their teachers. They were popular with their peers. They didn't run with any particular crowd. They were friends with everybody, and they were very well known around town. You know, in the 30s and 40s, there was no TV, there was no internet. High school sports were a huge deal, much bigger than they are today. And all these guys were star athletes. So they were very well known around town. Libertyville in those days was much smaller than it is today. It was a little under 4,000 people. The high school was probably 450. So they were all well known. They were all student athletes. They were all class leaders, and they were all friends with each other. In fact, Jack Terenovich and Ole Ekstrom, as I'll show you in a second, enlisted at the same time. So Lloyd Iverson will start on the left. These are in the order left to right of how they died or when they died on Okinawa. Lloyd was the only officer of the group. He was a pilot. He was an F-6F Hellcat pilot. I'll talk about that in a second. So he was a fighter pilot. He flew night fighters. He had an additional year of training before he came to the Pacific to learn how to do that. He was killed in an accident at Yantan Airfield. The accident was April 17th. He died 2 days later. We'll talk about him in a minute. Jack Terenovich that you see in that picture right there, that's my favorite picture of Jack, as I've described to people. He was almost 6'4", 160 pounds, dark red hair, freckled face, looked like he was 12 years old his whole life. And that's his enlistment photo from when he reported to basic training in August of 1942. And he's trying to look like a tough guy. And I don't think Jack could ever look like a tough guy. But he was a telephone lineman with an artillery battery that was used to be assigned to different units. So his battalion was assigned to 3 Amphibious Corps. They were given to the 1st Marines, 6th Marines, whatever. They weren't an entity unto themselves. He was a lineman. In those days, radios weren't all that great, and so they used radio telephones, and he would string very heavy rolls and reels of telephone line between artillery batteries, in addition to helping out on his artillery crew, which I'll explain in a minute. Ole Ekstrom was born in Sweden. Ole grew up in Lake Forest, actually. His dad was the landscaper for what is today the Glen Rowan House, which is across the street from Lake Forest College. Is still very much there. He came to Libertyville as a sophomore. He was a tanker. I was a tanker, so I can relate to Ole and knew what he did. He was on a Sherman tank crew with the 6th Marine Division. He was killed at Sugarloaf Hill on May 12th. Jack Brown was a boxer, as we'll discuss in a little bit. He was an infantryman with the very famous 1st Marine Division called the Old Breed, and he died at Wanna Ridge and Wanna Draw on the 14th of May. So Jack Terenovich, Ole Ekstrom, and Jack Brown each died, as we'll discuss, at a very pivotal moment, separate pivotal moments in the Battle of Okinawa. Jenny, we'll go to the next one. So here's our first one, Lloyd Iverson, class of 1942. In the upper left-hand corner, you see Lloyd with his parents and his sister Elaine, who was in the class of 1944. Elaine had 5 kids. I've gotten to know all of them. Most of them, I hope, are on the call, or several of them on the call. They were very helpful to me, as were all the families, in helping create these stories. You see Lloyd probably in 8th grade, I think, in that picture. In every picture I found of Lloyd Iverson, in drops of ink, the school newspaper, in the yearbook, and in the Marine Corps, he's always smiling. He wasn't a very big guy. His nickname was Pee Wee. He was 5'6", about 125 pounds, but he was a great athlete. You can see here he played on the varsity basketball team. His senior year, he also played the clarinet in band and orchestra. He was a very busy guy, particularly his junior year. This photo that you see in front of you that has Lloyd with the red on his number 52, and next to him is number 33 and number 22, is a very eerie foreshadowing of the impact of war on Libertyville and on Libertyville High School. So Lloyd is 52. Next to him, number 33 is Dale Kranz. Next to him is Pete Christon. Dale Kranz died in 1944 in France, and Pete in 1945 in Germany. So 3 members of that starting basketball team never made it back after they were finished. I should note that my friend Dale Eggert, who I think is on the call, he wrote an article, several articles a few years ago that I saw when I was doing some research about the impact of war on Libertyville and Libertyville High School. There were 21 young men from Libertyville who died in the war. You're looking at 3 of them right here, including our other couple of Marines that died as well. So let's talk some more about Lloyd, Jenny, on the next slide. So Lloyd grew up in Waukegan. His dad worked for Eric Bolander Construction, which was in business in Libertyville until just a few years ago. But back in the 30s, They did road construction, bridges, infrastructure, and his dad was a crane operator. But he came to Libertyville, actually came to Mundelein in 1938. Back in those days, Libertyville High School was Libertyville Township High School because there was no Stevenson, no Vernon Hills, no Mundelein. And so other than Waukegan and Lake Forest, that was about it in Lake County. So he lived in Mundelein, but he came to Libertyville High School as a sophomore. Lloyd, his whole life growing up as a child, loved flying, loved the idea of airplanes, had airplanes. His family said had airplanes, model airplanes hanging from his room, posters, all kinds of things. But he always wanted to be a pilot. I'm going to read to you something from the Drops of Ink, which is the student newspaper, and it'll show you a little bit about who he was. It was an interesting description of Lloyd. It says, curly-haired, blue-eyed Lloyd Arbison is the junior class president. Lloyd came from Waukegan his sophomore year. He plays clarinet, likes Bob Crosby's orchestra, and the song Maybe. Lloyd likes the combination of green and brown and loud sport clothes. In fact, he's even been accused of wearing his pajamas to school. Lloyd fits right in with his ambitions. He builds model airplanes that goes to all aviation films. After college, he hopes to fly or be an aviation engineer in the Army or the Navy. So Lloyd decided he wanted to be a fighter pilot. So he went to flight school for a year, 4 different locations around the United States. And in those days, what they would do, start you out in small biplanes and then work your way up through larger aircraft until you got your wings. And so once he got his wings, he decided to be a night fighter. So he was assigned to the Hellcat, which you see right here, which by about 1944 had really become the premier fighter in the Pacific. It was a very durable plane. It was a very large plane. It weighed about 12 tons. He decided to become a night fighter. And so he had 1 additional year of training. So Lloyd, from the time he went in until he finished his night fighter training in the Hellcat, only finished up flight school in December of 1944. So just prior to the invasion of Okinawa, whereas the other guys have been in the theater for quite some period of time. The night fighter Hellcat is known by that bulb you see on the right wing down there, and that contained the radar. Prior to this, radar was really only on the ground. There were advances in miniaturization, so the aircraft was able to have radar in it, and they could fly at night, which in Okinawa was very important because Japanese kamikaze or suicide aircraft were attacking the fleet 24 hours a day. So they would go up at night and do these flights. Next slide, Jenny. So what happened to Lloyd was he didn't come ashore. The invasion started April 1st, 1945. Our 3 other Marines came ashore on the first day. The planes couldn't come in until about a week later because the airfields had to be captured first. So Kadena and Yantan airfields were both captured. He was at Yantan. He flew in on the 9th of April. On the 17th of April, just a little over a week later, he had an accident. And a little bit more about who Lloyd was in a moment. He was the youngest pilot in his squadron. There were 30 aircraft in that squadron, and he was named the assistant operations officer. The operations officer, whether you're in a ground unit or in the air, are the people who plan the combat patrols in this case at night. And so to be an assistant operations officer at the age of 20 and the youngest pilot in his squadron tells you a lot about his maturity, his leadership, and his ability as a pilot. So what they used to do to try to get as many planes in the air at night as possible, they would take off 2 at a time. And if you can see my hands, you'd have a flight leader and another one right behind it. So on the night of April 17th, Lloyd and his flight leader were prepared to take off. And the only thing that's on at night, there's no runway lights because the enemy's only 4 miles away. It's all total blackout conditions. The only light that was on was the red light on the vertical stabilizer on the back of the airplane in front of it. So 2 planes, each weighing 12 tons, get up to 85 miles an hour, one traveling right on the tail of the other until they get into the air, and they would go up and fly in shifts. And they would be paired with 2 planes from a sister squadron. So Lloyd was in the 543rd, the 542nd was there. So on this particular night, they did their briefing as the assistant operations person. Lloyd participated in that. They went out to the flight line in blackout conditions, got in their planes. The flight leader was first, Lloyd was right behind him, and that's what you see on that bottom runway. On the other top of it right there, it says Clyde Hill. We have a picture of Clyde Hill. Clyde Hill was a lieutenant in the 542nd. There were 2 planes obviously coming over to follow Lloyd and his flight leader. Clyde was in the first plane. His wingman developed engine trouble and had to turn back. Clyde didn't apparently feel like following in behind Lloyd and his flight leader, so he tried to take off from the taxiway, which is that thin line that you see there heading towards the X. So what you have is Lloyd and his flight leader on the runway. About 200 yards away from him is Clyde Hill on the taxiway. because it's dark and because the ground control people weren't used to dealing with night fighters, by an accident, they gave all three planes permission to take off at the same time. Well, you can see, you can do the math in your head and figure out what happened. So you had three aircraft all leaving at the same time, all traveling at 85 miles an hour, and they arrived at that X at exactly the same time. And the result was disastrous. I read the accident investigation report. Somehow Lloyd's flight leader managed to see Clyde Hill at the last moment and took evasive action. Didn't say how he did it, didn't say if they were still taxiing or if they had taken off, but he missed him. Lloyd had no such luck. What ended up happening was Lloyd's plane went into Clyde Hill's plane like this. He just T-boned him, went right through his aircraft, killing Clyde Hill instantly. Both planes exploded. 500 gallons of aviation gas lit up the night sky. Lloyd's plane kept going until it stopped. The rescue crews came and got him out. But he had major blunt force trauma to his head. He had burns over most of his body, and he had inhaled gas fumes at the time. So they took him to an evacuation hospital. There was no way to get into an offshore ship in those days and in helicopters. And all they could do then, as is now the standard of care, was copious amounts of morphine. And so he was unconscious from the moment of the accident, mercifully. And then he died 2 days later in the evacuation hospital. Next slide. So this is Jack Cherenovich. We're going to talk about Jack for just a few minutes here. This is his senior class picture. A number of students who were prominent students had separate pictures like this in the yearbook all by themselves, and there's Jack's right there. He was a basketball player. He's kind of kneeling down, second guy in from the left, as Coach Bergstrom gives them all of their instructions. He also played football. He was a center on the football team his senior year that went undefeated. Next slide. So Jack was assigned to a 150 millimeter field gun called a Long Tom. There were two 155 millimeter guns. One had a much smaller barrel. This is an enormous weapon. It had a crew of 12 people. You can see all those guys around the gun right there. It was a field gun. It wasn't a cannon. It wasn't a howitzer. It was so big they call it a field gun. And that's what he did. And he both ran wire from his battery to headquarters batteries, adjacent units. And then when he was done running wire, he would load shells and do whatever else they needed to fire the main gun. Next slide, please. So for each of our ground guys, each of our three ground Marines, I'm going to show you this same map. This is the southern end of Okinawa at about the time of the offensive. And so what had happened was Okinawa was a relatively long island, but very, very narrow. And the narrowest part is what you're looking at right here with these, where the red and the black lines come across. And the Japanese commander had decided he was not going to meet the Americans on the invasion beach. He had to keep his forces where they were. And he had two lines, through two defensive lines. The first one was meant to be temporary. The second one was meant to be permanent. The temporary one is the one at the top where you see the little hash mark teeth run underneath the white bar with the X. That was called the Machinado line. That was designed to test the Americans, hold them up, delay them as long as possible. And then the Japanese would fall back to the Shuri line, which is the big black line in the center, named for the Shuri Castle, which is an ancient holy site on the island of Okinawa, the home of the ancient Ryukyu kingdom. It was 1,000 feet tall on an island that didn't have a lot of tall mountains. And so that was the primary Japanese position. So first the Americans had to get through the Machinado line, which is that line you see up on the top. What had happened by consolidating all of their forces on these two lines is the Japanese forced the Americans to come to them in hand-to-hand fighting. This had been the Japanese method the last 2 years to get the Americans to do that. When they concluded they weren't going to win the war, the Japanese strategy became to make the Americans pay such a price that the American leadership, military and political, would never think about invading the home islands. That was their greatest fear, because if they invaded the home islands, they would get unconditional surrender. They would destroy the warrior class. They would destroy what's called the Kokatu, which is the emperor is the divine leader, and that's the last thing they wanted. So their effort the last several years was to make all these succeeding battles, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and now Okinawa, as horrible as possible, so the Americans would never think to come forward. In doing so, they channeled all of the fighting to this very narrow end of the island. You can see it's only about 5 miles across. As I told the students last week, that's the distance from the entrance of Libertyville High School to Lake Bluff if you go east. So not a very long place to put 200,000 Americans on the north and 130,000 Japanese to the south. So by doing that, the Americans could not use tanks as effectively, couldn't use artillery as effectively, and basically had to force the infantry to go into cave to cave fighting, which ended up being a slaughter. There's a reason that more than 12,000 Americans died in this battle, is because that's what they had to do. So on that very first line, this fighting had been going on for about 3 weeks until about the third week in April. And on this one particular night, they had Jack's big guns brought up because they weren't effective. The big guns were not effective firing at the Japanese from far away. The Japanese just simply go in their caves and come back out when it was over. So what they thought was to bring the artillery pieces up closer, shoot at the Japanese at point blank range, take away a number of the things they had put in front of the caves. So they brought Jack's gun battery up on the evening of the 23rd, got it set up late in the evening. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the Japanese had planned that night to use fog that had set in as a way to move finally, after 3 weeks of fighting, from the Machinado line back to the Shuri line, which is where you see those arrows going. They unleashed the largest artillery assault, the Japanese did, of the Battle of Okinawa. And Jack's artillery unit was hit before they could return fire. He was killed with multiple shell fragments to the head. 3 of his battery mates were wounded. His battery sergeant, a guy named Sergeant Robert Kempton from Chicago, rescued the 3 battery mates and went back and got Jack's body that night. About the whole attack lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, the Americans found out the next day, had retreated off the hill to the Shuri line. So this was the first sort of pivotal moment in the ground battle of Okinawa, and Jack unfortunately was killed. Had he lived those last 17 minutes of the barrage, he probably would have survived the war, because his unit was pulled back after that and did not engage again in combat. So he died at the very first epical moment when the Marines and the Army took that first Machinado line. Next slide, please. If you've never seen what a telegram looked like in World War II, there were so many casualties, and this is deaths, soldiers and Marines being wounded or missing in action. This is what it looked like. Today, if we lose a soldier or a sailor, a chaplain and a casualty assistance officer goes to the house. In those days, a guy drove up in a brown Western Union car, and he went to the door and he handed the parents a yellow telegram. And this is the telegram you see up on top. It says KIA, which is killed in action. It's to his mom, who lived at 201 South Milwaukee Avenue, which is where the auto parts store is today, just south of 176 and 2 doors down from where my dad lived. And it said, "I deeply regret to inform you that your son, Private First Class Jack Taranovich, died on 23 April at Okinawa Island." This is what they got. That was all they had. So this is what each of our families got at some point in time. Early in the battle like this, these telegrams came pretty quickly because casualties hadn't mounted up yet. By the time we got to Ole Ekstrom, his parents weren't notified until June, and he died in May. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about Ole Ekstrom, the class of 41. You see on the left-hand side, he too had a special feature in the yearbook. He was called the man of dynamic personality. What's funny about that is in no picture in this yearbook or in the Marine Corps is Ole ever seen as smiling. But somehow he was the man of dynamic personality, and he was the head of the social committee, which in those days was almost equivalent to being a class officer, because the President's social committee was the one that helped plan all the activities for all 4 classes throughout the school year. In fact, you can see him there in May of his junior year making prom plans with his peers in the drops of ink. Next slide, please. So this is a group of Marines from Lake County, Illinois, that went down to Chicago on July 30th, 1942, and enlisted. They're all Marines. I think about 7 are from Libertyville High School. Ole is to the left, or kind of left center in the yellow, standing. Jack is kind of kneeling down to the right. There are a couple other Libertyville Marines in here we're not going to talk about. What's interesting about this is taken at the old Homer Derringer post in Waukegan, American Legion post, which is no longer there. It's a park. But if you looked at this, you'd think this is like, 50 guys going off to a ball game or something. You'd have no idea that they were going off to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. Next slide, please. This is the left-hand slide is that same group. Jack's in the back. Ole's kind of forward. Bob Strand is next to Jack, and kneeling down below is Lloyd Gossel, whose dad, Ray Gossel, is a teacher today at Libertyville High School, who gave me these photographs. Same thing to the right. You can see Ole. This is after graduation. Ole and Jack, and then Bob Strand, and then Lloyd off to the side. Next picture. So this is their basic training platoon in 1942. They got out there in August, and they were done by around the end of the year. Ole's in the upper left-hand corner. Jack is the tallest one in the center. Bob Strand's next to him. A few more Libertyville guys in here. This platoon was huge. This is like 2 times the size of an infantry platoon. It was that way because they were pushing so many guys through at one time. But this was their graduation picture. I think it was December of 1942. Next picture. Next slide. So I mentioned Ole was a tanker. This is an actual photograph of his tank company, of the 6th Tank Battalion. He was an Alpha Company, A Company. The forward, I don't know when this is. I can't quite tell. It wasn't dated. The forward tank appears to be disabled because that looks like the crew is out of the tank. If you look on there, you see all the treads and other stuff put on the sides of the tanks. The Japanese, because the fighting was so close, the Japanese had magnetic anti-tank mines, and they would come out and put them on the sides of the tanks. So the tankers learned to put rubber tracks, wooden pieces of logs, wherever they could get on there to keep the Japanese from putting those on there. So this is what he drove in the Battle of Okinawa. Next slide. So when Ole and the 6th Tank Battalion first landed, they went up north past that American flag you see up at the top, all by themselves. 6th Marine Division went up. There was a small group of Japanese up there, about 2,000. They took care of them and then came back down. That's why everything north of that at this point was in American hands. This is the one we saw a second ago. By the time Ole died, which was May 12th, 1945, they were fighting at the second line, which is the Shuri line, the only place the Japanese had the majority of their forces in the center of that drawing. And you see Sugarloaf in red, that little arrow around there, and then the white X, and that's where Ole was killed. At this point, the American objective was to try to get around the flanks of the Japanese. That's why you see those 2 little arrows, one to the left, one to the right. 6 Marines, the 1st Marines, were trying to get around to what you see as the left side. There was a place there I'll show you a picture of in a second called Sugarloaf Hill, a very, very famous battle in the war. He was killed there on about the 2nd day. On the day he was killed, it was an absolute bloodbath for the Marines. They only managed a few yards. More than 200 were killed, including him. And that's where he met his fate. So we can go to the next slide. So there's Sugarloaf Hill. I mentioned before, there's not a lot of tall hills in Okinawa, at least in the central southern part of Okinawa. The Sugarloaf Hills maybe 80 to 100 feet high and not very long, but it was that whole front of that hill was covered with defensive positions that all had crossfire, and the Americans had to move up to them. And it was just a slaughter for nearly a week, even after Ole was killed. His tank would have been coming around the right side, which you see right there when it was disabled. Next slide, please. So Ole was awarded the Silver Star. What happened on the afternoon of May 12th is he went forward with 4 tanks in his platoon to support one of the infantry regiments that was trying to take the hill. All of the tanks were disabled. One went in the ditch. His tank and 2 others were hit by mines and destroyed. His tank commander was grievously wounded, knocked unconscious. He took him out of the burning tank. This is his Silver Star citation. Took him out of the burning tank to another tank that was moving to safety, as they couldn't take the fire. They had to get back off the hill. If you've ever been on the back of a tank when it's moving, even on smooth surface, it's pretty rough. So he threw his tank commander on the back of the tank and threw himself on top of him to hold him down. The man was unconscious. And in the process of that happening, he was struck by machine gun fire and he died. But the Silver Star is the nation's 3rd highest honor for valor in combat. You can read this here. It was presented to his parents a year after his death at Great Lakes Naval Training Center. One of the postscripts of this story is that Ole's niece, Mary Martindale, told me that after the war, the tank commander came to Lake Forest to visit Ole's parents and to thank him for saving his life. This is something that happened quite routinely after the war, where survivors would come and find the parents or the families of their friends. His tank commander lived to be quite old, was married 60 some years and had, I think, 7 children. And that was the great gift that Ole gave to his tank commander. Next slide, please. So we're going to go on to our 4th Marine is Jack Brown. Jack grew up in Libertyville, but moved away after 8th grade at Rockland School. His dad worked for the telephone company in town, but got a promotion to go to Northbrook. So he moved down to Northbrook. But he was a very well-known boxer. As my friend Dale Eggert would tell you, back in those days, Boys Club was about boxing. Jack also boxed in Golden Gloves. The picture on the right I think this was 1937, he was the most improved boxer. You can see the old tile walls of the Jackson Avenue gym of the Brainerd building behind him. Next slide, please. So these are the Fighting Brown brothers. Some of these names on the bottom may be familiar, but his brothers are on here. You can see there's 4 of them. And Jack is kind of in the center of the picture, but they were all boxers back in those days. Next slide, please. So here we are back to our slide again. 2 days after Ole died, the 1st Marine Division, which is in the center under that white X, were trying to get around that same side that you see where Ole Ekstrom was killed. And right about there is Wanna Ridge and Wanna Draw, and the distance between the two was known as Death Valley. It was the same thing. This was Marine infantry this time, trying to advance on Wanna Ridge and Wanna Draw. His company was selected to lead the 1st Division, the 1st Regiment's fight up to the top of Wanna Ridge. They actually made it up to the top of the ridge, but could not hold the position. And he was killed, likely by grenade fire. One of his guys in this company, at this time, his company was probably down to about 60 guys out of 150. It was desperate fighting. And one of the guys in his company was awarded the Medal of Honor in that very same fight, this very same afternoon that Jack had died. Jack had previously been in the Battle of Peleliu, which is the 2 battles before. It was the battle before Okinawa, or excuse me, Iwo Jima. He was wounded in the shoulder 15 minutes after he landed and was evacuated off the island in time to recover and then come back for the Battle of Okinawa. Next slide, please. So this is Wanna Ridge and Wanna Draw. These are photographs taken several days before Jack Brown was killed. You can see kind of the nature of it. On the left, a lot of those trees were scorched by artillery. On the right, you can see them moving towards Wanna Ridge itself, and that would have been the ridgeline on the right where Jack was killed. Next slide. So on the left is the letter that his parents got indicating that he had been wounded in action. The letters were very interesting. They were form letters, but they were written sometimes very long. This one's 3 paragraphs long. On the right is the letter that he received after the telegram that talked about how he was killed at the Battle of Okinawa. One of the things, I'm going to stop right here for a second. People have asked me, where do I get all this information? I went through a source that I know that got me the official Marine Corps records for all 4 guys. The Marine Corps, being small, has the advantage, I think, of being much more adept in their record keeping, particularly in World War II. And so I was able to right away and get the electronic files for each of these 4 guys. The files are, in some cases, 100 pages long. They go right from the beginning, from the documents that these guys signed when they enlisted, the letters their parents signed to let them in under the age of 21, and then all of their records all the way through their training, anything that happened to them, any awards, and all of the ships that they were on, and how they got to where they got over the course of 3 years on their way to Okinawa. And these are just a couple of examples of where those came from. But these records are replete with very detailed information, basically from the day they were enlisted until they were repatriated back to the United States a couple of years after they died. Next slide, Jenny. On the left is a newspaper article locally that said that Jack had been killed in Okinawa. It's kind of hard to read. If you go to Butler Park in Libertyville, there is a bench right as you come in from the first parking lot, at the end of the big football field before you go up the hill to the small football fields. And you can see there it's in honor of Jack Brown, U.S. Marines, killed in action. In his honor, never forget. So that bench is there today if you want to go see it. Next slide. So one of the things you see when you go through these records is for every person that was killed, there is a list of their personal effects. And this is a list of personal effects of Jack Cherinovich, the second one that was killed, the artilleryman. And you can see it's a complete inventory of everything that he had in his possession. And they have sort of the usual things you'd think somebody would have. He's got some extra clothes. He's got hygiene supplies, pens, paper. You know, the only way they could communicate was through pretty censored mail, but you see there's sheet mail, air mail, all kinds of stuff that he had. He also had some invasion money, something like 40 yen, I think. But at the very top of the list, the very first thing on his list of personal effects was his school book, 44. That was the Libertyville High School Nautilus yearbook from the class of 44. His younger brother Gene was in the class of 45 and had sent that to him so he could keep track of what Gene was doing, because he was a star athlete himself, as well as what was happening. So if you think about all the things that Jack Trianovich would have been lugging around the South Pacific and the many campaigns he was in, certainly at Okinawa, the very first thing they got out of his bag was the school book, which was the Nautilus from 1944. Next slide. So what happened to these guys after they were killed? I'll spare you some of the details. You can read about it in the book. But what happened is, even before the battle began, once the Americans came ashore and secured the northern part of the island, they began digging major cemeteries. Each division was responsible for their own, 1st Marine, 6th Marine, 96, all the different Army units as well. And they would dig these large cemeteries, which, for lack of a better term, were long ditches. They would bury the guys in ponchos or blankets, tag them with a dog tag, and they would keep them there for a period of time before they were reinterred. This is the actual interment report on him. This is Jack Trianovich. On the 96th Infantry Division Cemetery, he was assigned to an Army unit. That's why he's in the 96th Cemetery. And what they would do, just for later identification, when they had to reinter these guys later, you can see who he's buried on the right and who he's buried next to on the left. These were guys that you didn't know. They were just in different units that were killed around the same time. And I looked up and tell you in the book who these guys are, but this is what they did. I mean, they had no place to put 12,500 dead. They had to dig mass graves and do it temporarily, keep track of them, and then come back and get them later. Such is the horror of war. Jenny, next one. So what happened was, parents were given 2 choices, and the choice was irrevocable. They could have their son returned to the United States for burial, or in an American military cemetery overseas. In the Pacific Theater, that's really the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, which hadn't been built yet. It's called the Punch Bowl. It's in an extinct volcano above Honolulu. In the case of Jack's mother, Myrtle, she said, I want him to, you can see the checkbox, remain to be interred in a permanent military cemetery overseas. So he's buried at the Punch Bowl in Honolulu, but that's what that form looked like. You'll notice on here too, it says 1948. These guys, all 4, in fact, most of the Pacific dead and most of the European dead, which in total is about 280,000 Americans, those that were brought home were not brought home until the spring of 1949, because there were so many and there was so much distance and they weren't ready to bring them back. So you can imagine how it was for the family. Your son is killed in April of 45 or May of 45, and you got to relive this again 4 years later when they're brought home for burial. Next slide, please. This is the confirmation letter after the one Myrtle sent in. It says your son's remains will be permanently interred in the National Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii, which they were. So all of this correspondence is in their records. Next slide, Jenny. This is the election for Jack Brown. They said remains to be returned to the United States. They didn't want him buried overseas. He's buried at Ascension Cemetery in Libertyville with his parents, but that was their election, was to bring him home. Next slide. These are just looks in 1945 at what these cemeteries looked like. They actually made them look very nice, despite the way I portrayed them to you. But 96 is where Jack Trianovich was buried. The 1st Marine Division's Jack Brown, Lloyd the pilot, and then Ole Ekstrom were buried in the 6th Marine Division Cemetery, as you can see here. Those cemeteries no longer exist. Next slide. So here's the grave of Lloyd Iverson. It's up in Bruce, Wisconsin, which is close to where his family came from. He's buried with his parents. I had a chance to stop there last July. I was up in Minnesota. I stopped by and I saw his niece and nephew, Carol and Don Jaskowiak, and had a chance to meet them, which was very good, and to see his grave. The picture on the left is one of the times he was in flight school. Next slide. So Jack Trianovich is buried in Honolulu. That's his grave right here. That's his picture from the senior class. You can see senior officers from the 1941 yearbook. Next slide. So Ole is also buried at the National Memorial Cemetery at the Punch Bowl. He's not very far from Jack, and they were buried one day apart in 1949 when they were brought back again. They're great markers. They're in the upper right-hand side. And Ole was the varsity track runner as well. He was pretty quick. Next slide. Here's Jack Brown at Ascension Cemetery with his parents. It's really hard to see as old as this tombstone is, but his parents' name and his name are on the bottom. And on the bottom, it says he lost his life in Okinawa. He was 19 years old. Next slide. This is a cartoon that was in one of the Libertyville yearbooks. I think this was 1944. So my dad, as Jenny mentioned, graduated from Libertyville in 1947. So his first 2 years at Libertyville were the last 2 years of the war. And I have all of his yearbooks, and they're replete with the 43 to 45 have all this kind of stuff in here. So you see Uncle Sam carrying a football, blocking or pushing, stiff arming Hitler. Hideki Tojo is on his heels and Mussolini is laying on the ground. This was drawn by Bob Pierce, who was one of the students. But this is a full-size page that was in the Nautilus yearbook. Next slide. This is something that I've only seen one of these. It's very interesting. If you can read it, it says, "Prepare for Victory Day celebration, which may take place at any moment." This is August of 1945. It was obvious that the war in Europe was already over. The war in Japan was pretty much over. This would have been after Okinawa. And this was put on telephone poles and business windows all over Libertyville. And it said, "At the wail of the sirens and the exploding bombs, you'll know it's here. Display your flags. Come to Cook Park, where a program will be in progress. Go to the high school in case of rain. A parade will be formed on the spot from all these different organizations." So this is where Libertyville was in August of 1945, after almost 4 years of war, 21 dead, countless more wounded. We're waiting for this thing to happen, and they were going to light off sirens and shoot off bombs and tell people to come to Cook Park. Next slide. So I'd like all of you, if you have the book, if you're going to get the book, if you're interested in Okinawa, this is my friend Steph. She lives on the island of Okinawa. Her husband's a Marine warrant officer. She lives there with her family. She has a Facebook site called Okinawa Battle Sites. And it's free to join. I encourage you to do it. And she and her husband on weekends as a hobby go to all the battle sites that took place on Okinawa, more than just what we have here. But they like to go into the caves, and they go into all the fighting positions, and they do video and photographs. You can see it. It's really interesting. And she has my book. That's what she's holding there. And she wrote me the other day, and she said that over the course of the next number of months, she's going to go to where each of our former Marines died and show me what that looks like today. Because in the book, it's pretty specific where they were, and she knows exactly where they were, and she's really an authority on the Battle of Okinawa. So if you have an opportunity, I encourage you to sign up on, it's free, her Facebook site, and keep an eye out. But in the meantime, you can see all the stuff that she does. It really kind of visualizes for you what I write about in the book all these years later. Okinawa looks very different today, I'll warn you, than it did in 1945. It's a lot of urban sprawl, but she takes you to the places where this took place. So that's it for all of our slides. Jenny, maybe we just go back to the first one that just has the book on it, and we can take some questions.
Sure. Let me see if I can get back there. Actually, I'm just going to go back one slide here because I don't think I can go all the way back very quickly. So
That's fine.
That. All right. I don't see anything in the chat or the Q&A right now, but we are open for questions. If you have anything for our presenter, please type it in and I will relay it.
While you're typing, I can tell you some questions that we had from the high school students last week. One of them was, how do I know where to cut off the research when you're writing a book like this? Which is a great question, because when you get excited about a book, I had so much research. I probably had 25 books, 100 pages of PDFs of different kinds. And then you get off on tangents. So it takes a lot of discipline to try to stay focused and take it from the reader's perspective, not to go down all kinds of alleys. But it's much better when you write a book to have lots of research than to have no research whatsoever. So it did take some time to kind of trim it up and make sure I was sticking to the salient points and keeping it to about 300 pages. Another question that I had, I'm sorry, Jenny, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. We just had one person said, "Thank you, lots of interesting information." Another person said, "One thing to remember, never forget." And then we have, how can you access Marine Corps records of other Marines?
There is well, you can go through the government, and if you do that, you may not get what you want. So what I learned was that there are places you can write to. You can look them up online. It'll show you, look up Marine Corps records, World War II. There's several places, but they're all government sites. They're not always staffed all the time. It could take up to a year to get the records. I found a guy, and I can provide the stuff to Jenny to show later, because it's his address, who used to work at the military personnel center in St. Louis. And he has a way to get records in a little bit of time. I had to pay a little bit of money for it, but I was able to get all those records within about 3 months instead of waiting over a year. So that's how I was able to access all those records. They come in an electronic file. It's pretty dense. It's pretty cool to read because there's all kinds of stuff that's in there. But one of the questions I had from the kids last week was, what was the most satisfying part of writing the book? And there were really two parts. The first part was meeting the friends, meeting the family of the four Marines. It took me a while. I was writing the book about 3 months. I wasn't quite ready to reach out to the families. I didn't know how to reach out to the families. And I thought, well, I got enough information. I'm going to try to reach out to them. And so what I did was I could see who the brothers and sisters were of our four Marines. I looked them up, looked up their obituaries, saw their kids, saw where they lived, and went to about the oldest one for each one, sent them a letter because I couldn't see their emails, got their address, and they all got back to me, all of them. In fact, all of them called me when I wrote them a letter. And I said, I'm not crazy. I'm writing a book about your uncle. I'm a retired healthcare executive. If you want to participate, that's great. If you don't, I'll share the information. Well, all four of them called me, and we're all very excited, and they were terrific in handing information, anecdotal stories, all kinds of things over to me. So meeting them and becoming their friends has been very important to me. And I think the other part is what typically happened after the war was families who lost a service person. They never talked about it after that. The pain was too great. And so in the case of our four families, they grew up not knowing very much about their uncles. And this happened all over the United States, not only for members who died, but also for guys who came back who just didn't want to talk about it. I got a note this morning from a woman who went to Libertyville High School who said her dad never talked about it, and we were told not to talk about it. But in this particular case, the families didn't know much about their uncles, and being able to deliver to them the complete picture of their uncles and then also part of their family. So they finally found out for the first time was really important to be able to do, and to be able to do it with their help was even more fun.
So I think you just addressed one of the questions was, did you reach out to the relatives and what was their response? And you addressed that. And actually, it sounds like one of the relatives is on the call.
Yes, Don Jaskowiak, I think, is on the call here.
Yeah, I just want to thank Joe again for putting this time into writing this. Thank you for the signed books. Thank you for coming up to Bruce and meeting Carol and I. Very nice to meet you. Thank you for visiting the grave sites to all four of these heroes. I think you addressed it. Maybe I said, how long did it take to write this book?
Well, it was 2.5 years in research. What happened was I'd done all the research because as I thought about these guys, I just kept finding more and more, and I liked all about them the more I researched them. And when I came to the high school a year ago and talked to the leadership team, I wasn't going to write a book. And when I was done, Tom Calentes, the principal, says, you have to write the book. He basically ordered me to write the book. So I did. It took 7.5 months to write it from the time I started until I finished. And that was writing 7 days a week. And the reason I did that was I wanted the book done by Memorial Day this last year, which I made it by about 2 weeks as a tribute to the four Marines. So about 2.5 years of research and then 7 months of writing and a little more research and meeting the families.
All right, we have 2 questions about getting the information. So one was how to get a copy of the presentation. This is being recorded, and so everyone who is in attendance will get a link later this week to the recording, so you can review it there. And a couple people have asked about how would they get a copy of the book. If you're local, the library does have a copy for checkout and a copy in the local history reference area. Joe, are there ways to get a hold of the book if they're not a local?
Well, if you know me on Facebook or any other way to communicate to me, just let me know and I'll send it to you. If not, I'm going to do a second printing after the first of the year, and that one will end up on Amazon. You'll be able to see it there.
Great. Let's see here. Someone has asked about, can you talk a bit about your tank involvement? What is it like to drive a tank?
It's a lot of fun, but it's also very dangerous. Well, it's, I chose tanks because I didn't want to walk. I suspect Ole Ekstrom did the same thing. Plus, Ole was a terrible shot with a rifle in his basic training record. So I think that's how he ended up being a tanker. I was a pretty good shot, but I wanted to ride and not walk. Modern tanks are amazing vehicles. They're big, they're heavy, they weigh 65, 70 tons. They can travel up to 60 miles an hour. They can see through fog, they can see through smoke, they can see through everything. They can hit targets that are 2 miles away. They're very dangerous vehicles, both to the occupant as well as to the enemy, because a tank doesn't care who it kills. So it was very interesting. I enjoyed it. It was great to be part of a crew operation. There's 4 people on a tank, and then we had 4 to 6 tanks in our unit. So I enjoyed it. It's a lot of work. It's very heavy work. Tank shells are heavy. It's hot. Modern tanks are air conditioned, but we never turned them on. I can't imagine being in a Sherman tank. I'm too big a guy to be in a Sherman tank. I can fit in a big modern tank, but I couldn't fit in a Sherman. You had to be a little bit smaller than me. Was there a question on there, Jenny, about cemeteries?
Yes, that's what I was just getting to. You mentioned that the cemeteries on Okinawa are no longer there. Is this because they were moved to either Hawaii and the USA?
Yeah, they were never meant to be permanent cemeteries. They were always called temporary cemeteries. And the manner in which they were buried, we don't leave our war dead wrapped in blankets. We take care of them properly, but it just took a long time to make that happen. But they were all shut down. And in fact, one of the things I asked Steph when she's out going around is to show us where those cemeteries, what that looks like today, because it's very difficult to find.
What was the nature of the major Japanese lines? Were they highly built up lines like the famous German lines?
They were more intense than the German lines. I describe it in the book. Either one of them was the same way, but what the Japanese did in Okinawa was they would put their artillery on what's called the reverse slope. So if you're facing the mountain, the artillery was on the other side, so you couldn't see it or hit it, and they would fire over the top to you. That took a lot more coordination than having it in the front. But they had caves where they would bring anti-tank guns in and out, mortars in and out, machine guns in and out, and all of these positions had what's called interlocking fields of fire. So anything that moved out in front to 180 degrees could be struck, and that's why it was so vicious in the fighting for the Americans to even get close to them. A lot of these tunnels were interconnected. They had food in the mess halls in the tunnels. They had flamethrowers that Americans used to get them out, but they also had hospitals, all kinds of things in these tunnels. These tunnels were not very big, but they were big enough to be able to withstand the bombardment prior to and then during the big part of the engagement.
Were flamethrowers used?
Flamethrowers were used. They started being used a couple of weeks after things started. They were more effective with tanks being turned into flamethrowers because they could get a little farther away. But flamethrowers on backpacks were absolutely used. There were a lot of really bad things that happened that I talk about in the book that you can read. that was the only way that they could get in close and secure those positions, and flamethrowers was one of them.
There are a couple other thank yous from the family of Lloyd about getting the information. Sure. I also just want to mention, not necessarily military records, but for those of you who are interested in researching your family history, the library does have a genealogy librarian. His name is Daniel Smith. So if you are looking for assistance in researching your family history in general, please do reach out to Daniel, and he can help you with local resources as well as library resources and other resources you may want to check.
Yeah, I will tell you, Ancestry.com now has a lot of high school yearbooks online. Libertyville High School is going back to 1936, I think, are online. So I was able to access some of those. And then Libertyville Library was kind enough to let me come in and see the Drops of Ink newspapers going back to the 1930s.
And we have the rest of the newspaper, or not the, well, we have newspapers here as well, but we have the high school yearbooks here and at the Historical Society and at the library as well for pretty much the full run. All right, I got it. Thanks. All right, I think we've addressed everything that's in the chat and the Q&A. Are there any other questions for Joe? All right.
Jenny, I had one thing I wanted to leave with real quick for people, and that was, there's a chapter in the book called The Grim Statistics, and to understand what actually happened on this island. There were 250,000 people killed on Okinawa. That's civilians, Japanese, and Americans. That's more people were killed than when both atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So 250,000 people died. Quite a few more were wounded. American forces had a 1 in 9 chance of being hurt. The ground forces had a 1 in 20 chance of being hurt, or 1 in 5 chance of being hurt. So it was an awful place. It was the most horrific battle of a series of horrific battles, where our 4 Marines ended up in April and May of 1945.
We did have one other question. What's your next book?
I don't know. I have to ask my wife. This one about killed me. This is a lot of work to do this. I've taken time off. I don't know. Send me some ideas.
Um, there's a question, is that where they planted the flag? Is that related to the famous picture? Is that what the person's thinking of?
The most famous photograph of the planting of the flag is on Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, which had taken place some months prior. That's the one that you see that the Marine Corps Memorial in Washington is built off the guys that are holding up the flag. The one that's on the cover of my book was on top Shuri Ridge in Okinawa. So that one is Okinawa. The other one that you're thinking of probably is on Iwo Jima.
Okay, I'm gonna take this as the last question. Will this be made into a movie?
Boy, I sure hope so. That'd be kind of fun. I sent a copy to Gary Sinise to see if he's interested in
Yeah.
it. I also have a historical fiction at the back of the book with Jack Cherinovich that would be kind of fun to turn into a small video, but that'd be kind of neat to see. It's a great story.
Cool. All right, well, we thank everybody for being here. We thank our presenter, Joe Nemmers. I want to wish everybody a very happy Thanksgiving. And I hope that you can make it to the Cook Home during our holiday open houses, and keep an eye out for our Spring History Matters series. We should have that out sometime after the first of the year, that schedule and the topic. So once again, thank you to Joe, and thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good evening. Thanks everybody. Have a good night.